My stepdad came into my life when I was 8. Old enough to notice the shift, young enough to blame myself for it. He wasn't cruel. That's important. People hear stepdad and start filling in blanks that don't belong here. He never yelled, never hit, never insulted me outright. He just didn't show up. And somehow that did more damage than if he had. He was steady in the way furniture is steady. Always there, technically. Always busy, always tired, always carrying the weight of responsibility like a badge of honor. He believed in providing. He believed in order. He believed emotions were messy and optional. My mom adored him, that was obvious. She softened around him in ways I'd never seen before, lowered her voice, smoothed her words. If he was late, it was because he was working hard. If he missed something, it was because he had bigger things to handle. I learned quickly which side of that equation I was on. At school events, he came sometimes, enough that people could say he tried, enough that no one could accuse him of not caring. But the pattern was inconsistent. If something conflicted with work, work won. If he was tired, tired won. If it didn't directly require him to be impressed, it could wait. I remember watching other kids scan the crowd for their parents and light up when they spotted them. I learned not to scan. It saved time. It saved embarrassment. It saved hope. Hope was the dangerous part. By middle school, I was good. Quiet good. Reliable good. The kind of kid teachers liked because I didn't need anything from them. I did my work. I stayed out of trouble. I learned that praise came easier when you didn't ask for it and disappeared faster when you did. At home, I stayed out of the way. I did dishes without being asked, took responsibility early. When my mom was overwhelmed, I helped. When my stepdad was stressed, I disappeared. I thought that was maturity. I thought that was love. Looking back, it was training. The defining moment, the one I still replay in my head years later, wasn't loud. That's the thing people don't get. Trauma doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just quietly rearranges the furniture inside you and leaves. I was 26, standing in a small bridal suite that smelled like hairspray and steamed fabric, staring at my phone like it might change its mind. I'd told myself I didn't care. I'd said it out loud even. It's fine. I'm fine. But my body didn't believe me. My hands shook just enough that my maid of honor noticed. My stomach felt hollow, like I'd skipped something important. I wasn't waiting for a speech, or tears, or some dramatic gesture. I was waiting for him to show up. 10 minutes before the ceremony, my phone buzzed. Can't make it. Something came up at work. Tell her congrats for me. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no call. Just a message that read like rescheduling a dentist appointment. I remember nodding when someone asked if everything was okay, smiling because it felt easier than explaining, walking down the aisle with my shoulders pulled back and my heart tucked somewhere safe and unreachable. People whispered. They always do. Some probably assumed it was a choice, some modern thing, some boundary. I let them believe that. It felt less humiliating than the truth. After the reception, when the noise died down and the room emptied out, I sat on the edge of the bed in my dress and stared at the floor. My husband, then new, still careful, sat beside me and didn't push. That mattered more than he knew. He couldn't make it, I said, finally. I know, he said. That was it. No defending, no excuses, just acknowledgement. That night didn't break me. That's the lie people like to tell, that there's one moment where everything shatters and you rebuild stronger. It was worse than that. It confirmed something I'd already suspected. I wasn't worth rearranging life for. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry to my mom. I didn't demand answers. I did what I had always done. I absorbed it, filed it away, told myself I was done needing him. And I meant it. At least, I thought I did. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't letting go of the need for approval. I was just changing the strategy. If I couldn't be loved for who I was, I'd be useful, impressive, unavoidable. That belief followed me quietly into adulthood. It shaped how I worked, how I loved, how I endured things I shouldn't have because I didn't want to be too much. I didn't ask for help. I didn't expect support. I didn't count on anyone showing up unless I gave them a reason. And for a long time, that worked. Because the world rewards people who don't need anything, but it also teaches them how to disappear inside themselves. By the time I stopped hoping he'd change, I'd already built a version of myself that didn't need him to, or so I thought. What I didn't know then was that absence doesn't lose its power just because you stop naming it. It waits, and it always shows up again right when you think you've outgrown it. If this emotional frequency is right, I'll continue with part 2, isolation, ambition, and quiet endurance next. If something feels off, tone too soft, pacing too slow, wound not sharp enough, say it now. Fixing it later is how stories fail.
After the wedding, I told myself I was done revisiting that moment. Like there was some internal switch I could flip. Past stays past, present moves on. That's what functional adults do, right? They compartmentalize. They don't sit around picking at old wounds like loose threads. So I got busy. That was always my move. I threw myself into work with the kind of focus that looks admirable from the outside and borderline unhealthy if you're being honest. Long hours, early mornings, late nights. I said yes to things other people avoided, took on responsibility no one wanted because it meant I wouldn't have to wait on anyone else to follow through. I wasn't chasing passion. I was chasing control. The hotel business wasn't some childhood dream. It wasn't romantic. It didn't come with a vision board or a 5-year plan taped to my wall. It was practical, tangible, a place where effort showed up as results, where systems mattered more than feelings, and where showing up actually counted for something. I started small, smaller than most people thought made sense. A run-down property off a highway exit most travelers barely noticed. It smelled faintly like old carpet cleaner and regret, the kind of place people booked because they had no better option. The bank manager raised an eyebrow when I signed the papers. "You sure you want to take this on alone?" Alone. The word landed harder than it should have. "Yeah," I said. "I'm sure." What I didn't say was that alone was familiar. Alone was predictable. Alone didn't flake at the last minute with a vague excuse. The first year was brutal. Not in a cinematic way. No inspiring montages. Just a steady grind that wore me down inch by inch. I handled front desk shifts when someone called out, cleaned rooms when housekeeping was short, learned maintenance the hard way because contractors cost money I didn't have yet. I slept in my office more times than I care to admit, ate meals standing up, answered emails at midnight because that's when the building finally went quiet enough to think. There were days I wanted to quit, real ones, not dramatic throw your hands up moments, quiet ones. The kind where you sit in your car after a 14-hour day and just stare at the steering wheel because turning the key feels like too much. On those days, my mind always drifted back to the same place. The bridal suite, the phone, that message, can't make it. Something about remembering it straightened my spine, not because it fueled me with rage or inspiration, but because failure felt heavier than exhaustion. Failure would have confirmed everything I'd spent years trying to outrun. So I kept going. Friends drifted, not dramatically, just gradually. I missed birthdays, declined invites, forgot to call people back. It wasn't intentional, I just didn't have room for anything that wasn't necessary, and somewhere along the way, I'd learned to classify myself as optional. My husband noticed, of course. He always did. He'd bring me food when I forgot to eat, sit with me in silence when I came home wiped. He never pushed, never framed it as concern. Just presence. That scared me more than neglect ever had, because presence came with expectations, and expectations felt dangerous. By year 2, the place started turning around. Reviews improved, occupancy crept up. Guests mentioned staff by name. They noticed things, small touches I'd obsessed over because I knew what it felt like to be overlooked. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt guarded, like success was something that could disappear if I acknowledged it too loudly. I didn't tell my mom much about it. She asked occasionally in that surface-level way people do when they want to be supportive but not involved. "Work going okay? Staying busy?" I answered in generalities. It was easier than hoping for more. My stepdad never asked at all. Not once. There were moments, late at night, spreadsheets open, coffee gone cold, when I caught myself wondering if he even knew what I was doing, if he'd care, if he'd show up now. I hated those thoughts. They felt weak, so I shoved them down and worked harder. By the time I expanded to a second property, I was exhausted in a way sleep didn't fix, the kind of tired that settles into your bones. I'd wake up already bracing for the day, jaw tight, shoulders tense, like rest was something other people got. People started calling me driven, resilient, impressive. I nodded and thanked them, like I was being polite at a party I didn't actually want to attend. What they didn't see was how isolated it felt to build something alone, to celebrate wins quietly, to carry losses privately, to have no one you trusted enough to say, "I'm scared this might not work," because somewhere along the way, you learned that saying that out loud made you a liability. The defining memory came back more often then, not sharply, just present, like background noise. I'd be standing in a half-renovated lobby, dust in my hair, checking off a to-do list, and suddenly I'd remember the empty chair at the ceremony, the assumption people made, the story I let them believe. I started to understand something I hadn't before. It wasn't just about him not showing up. It was about how easily everyone accepted it. By year 4, things accelerated. Faster bookings, investor interest, media mentions. I hired a small team, people who showed up, who cared, who followed through. It felt strange trusting others like that, letting go of control inch by inch. Success came, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt heavy, like carrying something fragile and expensive through a crowded room, waiting for someone to bump into you and ruin it. I'd hit milestones I used to dream about and feel nothing. No rush, no satisfaction, just a quiet, steady awareness that this was happening whether I felt ready or not. The people whose approval once mattered still said nothing. No congratulations, no acknowledgement, no "I see you." Part of me felt validated by that silence, proof that I really was on my own. Another part of me, smaller, quieter, still flinched every time my phone buzzed, half expecting it to be him. It never was. Until one day it was. The message itself was nothing special, casual, almost careless, a question about something unrelated, like the years in between didn't exist. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, felt that old familiar pull, the instinct to respond, to be helpful, to be easy. Then I noticed something else. The timing. The articles had just gone live. The numbers were public now. The success wasn't theoretical anymore. It was visible, measurable, hard to ignore. That's when it hit me. The silence hadn't been accidental. I wasn't unseen. I was inconvenient. That realization didn't hurt the way the wedding did. It didn't knock the wind out of my body. It settled instead. Slow, steady, undeniable. For the first time, I felt something shift. Not anger, not sadness. Clarity. I finished my work that night with an unusual calm, drove home without replaying conversations in my head, slept without that familiar knot in my chest. Because somewhere between the exhaustion and the isolation, I'd built something else besides a business. I'd built distance. And for the first time, it felt like protection instead of loss.
I woke up that morning to a headline that made my chest tighten before I even read the numbers. My hotel empire had officially hit a $470 million valuation. The kind of number that makes journalists want sound bites, investors start dialing, and industry insiders suddenly remember your name. I stared at the screen for a long time, letting it settle. Not pride, not excitement, just awareness. The numbers were real, undeniable, measurable, and for the first time in years, painfully visible to everyone who'd ignored me before. My phone buzzed, and I froze. Almost instinctively, I thought it was another reporter, maybe a journalist chasing a quote. But it wasn't. It was him, my stepdad. I stared at the message like it had morphed into a riddle. Family dinner at 7. Important discussion. No congratulations, no acknowledgement of the years I'd spent building something from nothing. Just a summons, like I was an employee he was checking in on rather than a human being he had once overlooked. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My first reaction wasn't anger. It wasn't joy. It wasn't anything familiar. It was clarity. This wasn't about him being proud. This wasn't about family. This was about opportunity, his need to use me now that I had become unavoidable. The realization landed like a stone in my stomach. The world doesn't change people. People reveal themselves, and he was revealing exactly who he had always been. I debated ignoring it, let him stew, let him twist in the vacuum he'd created for himself. But I didn't, because part of me was curious to see the exact expression on his face when he finally realized he no longer had power over me. I spent the day running through scenarios, but not in the way people imagine. I didn't rehearse dramatic speeches. I didn't fantasize about revenge. I made practical notes, boundaries, contingencies, points of control. That's what power looked like. Quiet, precise, and completely under my own terms. When I arrived at the dinner, the house felt the same. Expensive, polished, cold. The walls carried echoes of a lifetime of polite dismissals, of invisible expectations, of small kindnesses withheld. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and furniture polish. My stepdad was already there, seated at the head of the table, a posture that said CEO rather than father. My mother hovered nearby, a little too delicate, like porcelain in a wind tunnel. My half-brother Ethan, golden boy all his life, gave me the faintest raise of an eyebrow. I didn't greet them. I didn't apologize. I didn't smile. I sat, quietly placing my bag on the chair beside me, aware of every eye on me. The silence in the room was heavy, almost expectant. "Finally," my stepdad said, voice smooth, controlled. "You're late." I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady. "I arrived exactly when I intended," I said. My words were not loud, not sharp, but carried the weight of someone who didn't need permission to exist. Mom gasped. Ethan stiffened. My stepdad's jaw tightened. I didn't flinch. I had rehearsed for this, not what I'd say, but how I'd feel. Detached, deliberate, unshakable. The conversation started casually. Financial terms, portfolio updates, contractual obligations. I listened, corrected where I had to, interjected where it mattered. All the while, I held the folder Lena, my CFO, had prepared. Every overdue invoice, every defaulted loan, every mismanaged property, they were all documented. Everything tied directly to the empire my stepdad had spent a lifetime building, and now, for the first time, it was mine to control if I chose. The moment came when he tried to assert authority, like he always had. His voice didn't raise, it never needed to, but the underlying assumption was there. He expected me to bend, to negotiate, to acknowledge him as the arbiter of my life. I placed the folder in front of him, the papers slid across the table. "Everything here," I said, calm, precise, deliberate. "Every property, every debt, every mismanaged asset, it's all under my authority now."
The silence was palpable. My stepdad blinked. Ethan froze mid-breath. Mom's hands fluttered to her chest. No one moved. "You can't be serious," he finally said. His voice was low, controlled, but the first crack of disbelief had surfaced. I met his gaze evenly. "I am. You summoned me here because you need help. I'm offering it under my terms. 30 days. After that, control transfers completely." Shock spread across their faces. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but slow, inevitable. The same slow shock I had felt a dozen times over the years when people finally noticed me. But this time, I didn't flinch. "Why?" Mom whispered, almost pleading. "Why would you do this?" I kept my voice steady. "Because you didn't show up when it mattered. I built mine without you. Now I decide how to engage." My stepdad leaned back in his chair, trying to regain control, but the air around him had shifted. Not because I shouted, not because I threatened, because I had stopped performing for approval, because I had detached my worth from his recognition, because I held the key to everything he had once assumed was untouchable. "You're trying to humiliate us," he said, voice controlled, careful, sharp. "Destroy everything I've built." I shook my head. "I didn't take anything. You lost it. I just got there first." Ethan's face went pale. You bought it all?" he whispered, like speaking the words aloud might make them less real. "Yes," I said, short, deliberate. There was no joy, no satisfaction, only clarity. Mom started sobbing. My stepdad's face darkened, but there was nothing to salvage. No theatrics could erase the years of absence, the decades of quiet neglect. No apology could undo the repeated message I had received my entire life. Your worth is conditional. Your presence is optional. And now that pattern ended. We went through the legal details, lenders, contracts, transfer of ownership. My team had already ensured the process was airtight. Every signature, every clause, every contingency had been planned for months. I wasn't reckless, I wasn't vengeful, I was precise, deliberate, and emotionally detached. By the time the night ended, I walked out knowing something my family never had the ability to teach me. Authority over your own life isn't given, it's claimed, slowly, quietly, without spectacle, without needing their approval. Driving away, the city lights streaked past, and I thought about all the hours I'd spent shrinking myself, trying to be good enough for people who never measured up to their promises. I thought about the wedding, the empty chair, the years of quiet endurance. I wasn't angry, really. That's the shift. Rage is noisy. Pain is sharp. Clarity is silent. It presses down like gravity, steady, inescapable, unmistakable. By the time I parked at home, I realized that success alone didn't heal anything. Not the wedding, not the childhood, not the isolation. But control did. Boundaries did. Choosing myself over people who had always chosen their convenience over me did. I didn't need to celebrate. I didn't need applause. I needed recognition, not from them, not from the world, but from myself. And that was complete. Because for the first time in my life, absence didn't hold power over me. Silence didn't threaten me. Conditional love no longer dictated my choices. It wasn't victory. It wasn't triumph. It was freedom. And freedom was quiet.
The morning after that dinner, I woke up in my own apartment, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor, coffee brewing on the counter. For the first time in years, it wasn't a panic-fueled wake-up where I braced myself for someone else's expectations. It was quiet, solid, my space, mine. The folder from the night before still sat on the kitchen table. Contracts, ledgers, signatures, debt transfers. I stared at it for a long time, breathing slowly. It wasn't power I craved, exactly. It wasn't vengeance. It was clarity, the kind that settles into your bones when you finally stop performing for people who never deserved the show. I didn't reach out to him, didn't text my mom or Ethan. I didn't even call Lena, my CFO. I just sat for a while, feeling the absence of their voices, not as pain, but as confirmation. The dynamic had shifted. The strings they thought they held were gone, and that alone was a kind of peace I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. Weeks passed, and I moved through my life with a new rhythm. I toured the properties I now fully controlled, each one a reminder that I wasn't repairing my father's empire. I was reclaiming my agency. Broken carpets, faded wallpaper, and shoddy renovations became opportunities to set standards, to build spaces that were intentional, purposeful, and entirely under my guidance. Guests noticed, investors noticed, competitors noticed, and somewhere in the background, my family noticed too, but in a different way than I would have imagined. Not as pride or admiration, not as apology, just awareness, recognition, the kind that comes after necessity rather than choice. Mom left messages I never returned. Ethan posted vague social media updates, carefully worded to imply distress without actually addressing me. Dad stayed silent. His pride, it seemed, had no words. For a long time, I would have let that hurt. I would have folded myself smaller to accommodate their feelings, internalizing responsibility for the way they handled their emotions. But I didn't. I realized something vital in that silence. I was no longer required to make them comfortable. I wasn't responsible for mitigating the discomfort my absence or my success caused them. My life didn't exist to fill the gaps they created. One afternoon, standing in the lobby of what would become our flagship wellness retreat, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. Black blazer, hair pulled back, eyes steady. The woman staring back at me wasn't the girl who cried alone in a bridal suite waiting for someone who'd never show up. She wasn't the young woman who worked herself into exhaustion hoping to earn approval. She was whole. Whole not because I had money, not because I had power, but because I had claimed it for myself, without needing anyone else to validate the journey. Daniel noticed. He always notices. He didn't comment. He just slipped his hand into mine, a grounding presence. "It feels different, doesn't it?" he said softly. "It does," admitted I. "It's calm, not celebratory, just correct." That's the best word I could find. Correct. The world finally aligned with reality as I had long known it. I was enough, whether they acknowledged it or not. The following weeks were full of practical work, renovations, staffing, contracts, scheduling. Decisions that would have once required consultation with my stepdad or approval from my mother were now mine alone. I signed papers, set terms, approved hires, and built systems without a single phone call from them. The absence that had haunted me for decades now acted as a boundary, a buffer that allowed me to operate in peace. When my stepdad eventually reached out again, it was in a restrained, careful tone. He asked questions about a property's value, suggested meetings, implied expectations. I answered, directly, concisely, without emotion. I didn't engage in discussions about history, feelings, or reconciliation. That territory no longer belonged to him. It wasn't easy. Old habits die slowly. There were nights when I lay awake, thinking about all the times I'd shrunk myself, imagining if things could have been different, if he could have shown up that day. If love had ever been unconditional. Those nights were quieter than anger, subtler than grief, but they existed. I let them exist, without letting them dictate my actions. I established new rules, boundaries that protected my time, my energy, and my autonomy. I didn't answer texts immediately. I didn't accommodate emotional manipulation disguised as family concern. I spoke clearly and directly. I said no without apology. And the world didn't crumble. In fact, it moved better.
One afternoon, Lena called me with updates on new acquisitions. "Hannah, this is insane," she said. "You're controlling every failing asset he ever touched. You didn't just buy them, you're turning them into something people actually want." I laughed quietly. "I know. Not out of pride, out of recognition. It felt steady and real. Each space I transformed, each contract I executed, each system I installed wasn't just about revenue. It was about reclaiming pieces of myself that had been undervalued, ignored, or treated as optional for too long." Weeks turned into months. The family that had once set the rules quietly adapted to a new reality. My mother's messages became more cautious, more conciliatory. Ethan tried tentative suggestions on social media. My stepdad never acknowledged anything directly. That didn't bother me. Silence had finally lost its edge. I could interact on my terms, or not at all. One morning, I walked through a newly renovated lobby, sunlight spilling across polished oak floors. Guests were sipping tea, chatting softly. The air smelled clean, intentional, alive. I stood still, letting it settle around me. This was the life I had built. Not for him, not for anyone else, but for me, for the quiet, resilient girl who had learned to endure in the absence of unconditional love. I thought about the wedding often, but differently now, not as a wound, but as a guidepost. That empty chair, the terse message, the silence, it had shaped the strategies that allowed me to navigate life with precision. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't seeking revenge, I was applying the lessons it taught me, consciously and deliberately. Daniel joined me by the window. "You okay?" he asked. His voice wasn't probing, it wasn't intrusive, just steady, present. "I am," I said. I meant it, truly. "I think I've never been better." He smiled gently, like he always does, understanding, without comment. He knew I wasn't talking about the empire. I was talking about the quiet, deep kind of freedom that comes when you stop chasing validation from the people who never intended to give it. People assume that success heals every wound, that once the headlines carry your name beside numbers like $470 million, the emptiness disappears. That's not true. Recognition from others, especially those who never deserved it, doesn't fill the spaces left by years of conditional love. But autonomy does. Boundaries do. Choosing yourself over the people who trained you to be useful does. And that's what I did, every day in small ways, refusing to shrink, refusing to justify my presence, refusing to fold myself into their expectations. The freedom I felt wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was subtle, steady, quietly powerful in its constancy. Eventually, I stopped thinking about their approval entirely, not because I didn't notice, but because it no longer mattered. The silence of absence had become a protective wall, not a weapon. I could walk into a room, sign a contract, transform a space, make decisions, and leave without ever consulting them emotionally. And that felt right. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't catharsis, it wasn't a victory parade. It was acceptance, the recognition that love measured in usefulness had never been love at all, and that I didn't need it, that I could live fully, quietly, deliberately, and authentically without it. Standing in the lobby one last time that morning, watching the sunlight filter through warm oak, I understood something fundamental. Love, respect, and recognition are powerful, but only when freely given. The rest, conditional, transactional, absent, doesn't dictate your life unless you let it. I didn't let it. I didn't walk away angry. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need their approval, their reconciliation, or their acknowledgement. I simply walked forward, each step deliberate, each decision mine, each breath steady. And for the first time in my life, I could feel the quiet, unshakable presence of someone who had finally been enough for herself. The silence behind me no longer echoed, the absence no longer dictated my worth. The lessons they'd taught me, the hard, relentless training of conditional love, had done their work, and I had taken that work and used it to build a life that no longer depended on them. I was free, not triumphant, not healed in a fairy tale sense, just free, and that was more than enough.